Hey guys, I'm Abby Sharp. Welcome to Abby's Kitchen. Over the past decade, there has been a lot of debate and controversy over dietary fat in the wellness community, specifically around saturated fat and its impact on heart health. But is saturated fat actually bad for you? Does it even raise your cholesterol? And what about plant-based saturated fats like coconut oil? So in today's video, I will be taking a look at the research to do my very best to answer these very controversial questions. But before we jump into my review, I want to start with my general disclaimer that the information in this video is for entertainment and educational purposes only, and you should always seek out the help of a registered dietitian or medical professional for your unique needs. Okay, so before we get too far into the research, I do want to start with a quick overview of the different types of dietary fats, since not all fats are created equal. Under the unsaturated fat umbrella, monounsaturated fats have been found to promote heart health, decrease inflammation, and have an overall positive effect on blood cholesterol. So it is recommended that we try to include more foods like avocado, olive oil, and nuts and seeds in our diet. Polyunsaturated fats, which includes both omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids, are also associated with a variety of health benefits for our heart, brain, and joints, just to name a few. You can find omega-3s in fatty fish, flaxseed, chia seed, hemp seeds, walnuts, and soybeans. Omega-6s, on the other hand, can be found in foods like poultry, eggs, whole grains, nuts, and most commonly in vegetable oils like sunflower, corn, cottonseed, and soybean oil. Because omega-6 fats are so abundant in the diet, most of us are getting more than enough omega-6, but not enough omega-3 fats. I do not want to go too far down the rabbit hole on the whole omega-6 and omega-3 controversy, because that would require a whole other video to really unpack. But simply put, both omega-3s and omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are essential, meaning we need to get them from our diet. Simply put, omega-3s are largely anti-inflammatory, while omega-6s have some pro-inflammatory properties. But that is not necessarily a completely bad thing. Inflammation is a big bad word that has been co-opted by wellness culture, but inflammation is actually really important for some of your bodily functions like immunity. Too much or too chronic inflammation, however, is not so good and can potentially lead to a wide range of chronic diseases. This is where the recommended omega-6 to omega-3 ratio comes from. Most experts believe that the ideal ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s is about 4:1 or less, with pre-industrialized societies estimated to be getting closer to 1:1. Most Western societies today, however, are getting 20:1, or in some cases even higher. So this is why it's really key to us to make an effort to get more omega-3s in our diet. Trans fats, on the other hand, would be classified as a fat that you would want to limit or avoid, as research consistently shows that they may increase the risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and even death. In fact, trans fats may increase the risk of heart disease more than any other nutrient or food component. It's therefore not surprising that health authorities in Canada and the United States went so far as to ban the use of trans fats in food production entirely due to its proven detrimental effects. Most countries in Europe, Asia, South America, the Middle East, and South Africa have now begun to implement similar legislation to limit the use of trans fats. Now, when it comes to checking food labels, I just want to flag that food manufacturers can still say that a food product has 0 grams of trans fats as long as it has less than 0.5 grams per serving. But if you manipulate the serving size to an unreasonable small amount, you can get the trans fats down to under 0.5 gram, and then you can say it has 0 trans fats. So just to be sure about whether or not a food product does have trans fats, I would recommend looking at the ingredient list and looking out for any ingredients listed as partially hydrogenated oils. Okay, anyways, finally is saturated fats. And this is where the controversy lies. Saturated fats are commonly found in animal products like meat and dairy, but it's also found in some plant foods as well, like palm oil and coconut oil. But what is the verdict on saturated fat? Does it increase bad cholesterol, and should we be avoiding it entirely? Well, before we unpack the controversial research on saturated fat, I want to quickly talk about the different types of cholesterol and their role in the body. So cholesterol has several important functions like making bile acids for digestion, sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone, and developing vitamin D. However, information surrounding the relationship between cholesterol, food, and health has been very confusing over the past few years. It was first thought that all dietary cholesterol was bad and increased blood cholesterol, which ultimately led to the egg boycott of the 21st century since eggs are high in dietary cholesterol. Notice the nuanced difference here between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. I'll get way more into why eggs aren't such a big deal anymore later on in this video, but first a little overview on types of cholesterol and how they impact our heart. First is LDL cholesterol, low density lipoproteins, aka LDL, are mainly made up of cholesterol and lipids with a little bit of protein. The main role of LDL cholesterol is to transport cholesterol to body tissues to make things in our body like hormones. However, LDL cholesterol is commonly known as the bad cholesterol because when LDL levels are too high, they can build up on the walls of our arteries, making it difficult for blood to travel smoothly throughout the body. This can, of course, result in limited blood flow, blood clots, heart attack, or stroke. On the other hand, we have high density lipoprotein, aka HDL cholesterol, and this is known as the good cholesterol. This lipoprotein is important because it takes the excess bad LDL cholesterol that hangs out in our bloodstream back to the liver, where it then is either reused or excreted out of the body. Think of HDL cholesterol as the custodian that cleans up the leftover cholesterol, helping to keep the arteries clean and clear. Now, while not necessarily cholesterol, I also want to quickly touch on a few other compounds that also play a role as risk factors for heart disease. The first is the protein apolipoprotein B, which is one of the main components of LDL cholesterol and is also a strong predictor of heart disease risk. Then there are triglycerides, which are a type of fat that can provide your body with energy, but research suggests that it is also associated with heart disease risk. And the third that is often measured is total cholesterol, which is exactly what it sounds like. This includes both HDL and LDL, and while it is associated with heart disease, it doesn't really tell us the full story. It's really more of like a first tip that something might be up. Okay, now adding to the heart health confusion is the role of cholesterol particle size. So just like humans come in different sizes and shapes, so too do cholesterol particles. According to the American Heart Association, some studies have found that smaller LDL particles cause more cardiovascular damage than larger, more voluminous LDL particles. This is because larger LDL particles are unable to penetrate the artery compared to those smaller particles, which can more easily bury in and build up, which in turn causes atherosclerosis. Because of the ability of small LDL particles to wedge themselves into the arteries, it's no surprise that they are associated with a 40% increase in heart disease risk. It has been thought that this may also explain why some people diagnosed with heart disease may not have LDL cholesterol levels that are particularly high, but they may have a lot of smaller LDL particles putting them at risk. Having said that, one study suggested that once other risk factors were controlled for, LDL particle size was not an independent predictor of heart disease risk. We do need a lot more larger scale studies to tease this out, but why do some people, for example, have more small or more large LDL particles in their blood? We don't really know. But some research suggests that particle size may be determined by genetic and environmental factors like diet, exercise, medication, age, and hormones. Again, we need a lot more research to determine how we can limit the number of small LDL particles in favor of larger LDL particles if they even play a role in heart disease. But one older study did suggest that there may be an inverse relationship between triglyceride levels and LDL particle size. Meaning the higher your blood triglycerides, the more small LDL particles in your blood, and the lower triglyceride level is associated with larger LDL particles. With this in mind, in order to reduce the number of small LDL particles, it may be helpful to focus on evidence-based ways of lowering your overall triglyceride levels. So doing things like eating more fiber, exercising regularly, avoiding trans fats, eating more sources of omega-3 fats like fatty fish, limiting alcohol consumption, etc. All of which I'm going to discuss a lot more at the end of this video. Okay, so what the heck is the average person supposed to worry about when it comes to blood cholesterol? Well, much the same as the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that we talked about, the most important thing when it comes to cholesterol is having a healthy balance between LDL and HDL cholesterol. While LDL cholesterol does have important functions in the body, it's important that we have enough HDL cholesterol in the blood to counteract some of the negative effects of excess LDL. Meaning, if LDL is taking cholesterol through the body, but there isn't enough HDL to help remove any excess, LDL cholesterol is more likely to build up in the arteries and cause negative health impacts. So think of them as actually working together as a team, with HDL being the one in charge. If LDL starts taking over and HDL cannot keep up with the workload, total chaos ensues. However, if HDL takes control of the situation and makes sure LDL is bringing the right amount of cholesterol to our tissues, then we have another jolly day in the office. So to summarize and simplify, if I can, because I know it's complex, the major risk factors for heart disease that we want to try to modulate and the goals that we want to aim for are high HDL cholesterol, low LDL cholesterol, low apolipoprotein B, low triglycerides, and low total cholesterol. So with all this talk about cholesterol, what about the cholesterol in foods like eggs or shrimp? Is it safe to eat foods that are high in cholesterol, or will this impact my cholesterol levels? Like I briefly mentioned earlier, it had long been thought that dietary cholesterol from foods like eggs would have a negative impact on bad LDL cholesterol. However, research then started to show that the dietary cholesterol in eggs wasn't the same as the blood cholesterol being measured in the lab. In fact, some research pointed out that changes in dietary cholesterol intake had a very limited effect on a person's total blood cholesterol levels. To put it into perspective, reducing dietary cholesterol by 200 milligrams a day correlated to a reduction in LDL cholesterol of a pathetic 0.11 millimoles per liter. Meanwhile, most individuals with high cholesterol would require a reduction in LDL of over 15 times that amount. The lack of impact of dietary cholesterol from eggs on blood cholesterol was echoed in a recent 2020 meta-analysis, which concluded that moderate consumption of eggs of up to 1 a day is not associated with heart disease. With all that said, there's no need to specifically limit the amount of dietary cholesterol consumption for the average healthy adult with normal cholesterol levels. However, for individuals with high blood cholesterol levels, diabetes, heart disease, or other chronic diseases, the recommendation is to limit the amount of dietary cholesterol to around 200 to 300 milligrams a day, which is equivalent to about 1 to 2 eggs per day, depending on their size. Okay, so if cholesterol from foods doesn't necessarily raise blood cholesterol, then it must be from saturated fat, right? Like I said earlier, research on the impact of saturated fat on cholesterol and overall heart health is controversial stuff. Despite the growing amount of research on saturated fat and the influx of systematic reviews, health professionals have yet to really come to a consensus as to whether or not saturated fat has any major impacts on our health. The reality is, especially if you look back into the early metabolic ward studies of the 80s and the 90s, there are plenty of studies pointing the finger at saturated fat as raising bad LDL cholesterol and apolipoprotein B, as well as increasing the LDL to HDL ratio, all of which are really important negative risk factors that we already discussed for heart disease. As a result, most dietary guidelines, including the recently revised Canada's Food Guide, continue to recommend limiting saturated fat consumption to no more than 10% of your daily calories. Dietary recommendations to limit or avoid saturated fats largely stem from Dr. Ansel Keys' diet heart hypothesis from the 1950s. So Dr. Keyes' hypothesis was the first to suggest that fat should be avoided in the diet because it leads to heart disease. He then went on to spearhead the 7-country study of 1958, which was an epidemiological longitudinal study, meaning it measured the risk of heart disease in a large population over a long period of time. While the 7-country studies did find an association between saturated fat and heart disease, it has been heavily criticized even to this day. Critics have pointed out that Keyes cherry-picked data from countries based on desired outcomes and excluded countries like France, for example, which have higher intakes of saturated fat. The study also didn't distinguish between saturated fat and trans fats, and it also didn't consider sugar as a potential contributor. There have since been a lot of other better studies that have found an association between saturated fat intake and heart disease, including but not limited to the Ireland-Boston Heart Study, the Honolulu Heart Program, and the Atherosclerosis Risk of Community Study. While these studies all conclude that saturated fat intake is associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease, they also found that low intakes of polyunsaturated fats and high fiber complex carbohydrates were also associated with increased risk. Similarly, a recent 2020 meta-analysis concluded that reducing saturated fat intakes lowered the risk of cardiovascular disease by 21%, but this reduction had little effect on the risk of dying. The review likewise suggests that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats and healthy carbs may also be beneficial. There have also been other recent meta-analyses that add tons of confusion. The 2014 publication in the Annals of Internal Medicine found that there was no association between saturated fat and heart disease, but this study was heavily critiqued for its poor research methods. There was also a more recent 2015 Canadian meta-analysis and systematic review of 12 prospective cohort studies, where the authors similarly concluded that saturated fat does not appear to be significantly related to coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, or all-cause mortality. What they found was that replacing saturated fats with carbohydrates had no beneficial impact. But replacing saturated fats with monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats did have a positive impact on cholesterol levels. In fact, it was found that including more unsaturated fats may reduce the risk of heart disease by about 30% and lower bad LDL cholesterol. Now, it's important to note that the authors didn't specify whether the type of carbohydrates used were high fiber carbs or refined carbs, which would be a really important distinction, as high fiber, low GI carbs have been shown to have a positive impact on cholesterol and other biomarkers of disease. For example, research I've already cited has found that lower glycemic index carbs are a healthy alternative to saturated fats. There was also a large 2010 prospective cohort study of over 50,000 Danish women and men, which found that replacing saturated fatty acids with lower glycemic index, higher fiber carbohydrates was associated with a lower risk of heart disease, whereas replacing saturated fats with higher glycemic index carbs was associated with a higher risk. So it is really all about the little details. Another 2016 systematic review and meta-analysis with over 600,000 participants specifically looked at butter consumption, which, as we know, is high in saturated fats. Here it was found that there was a small to neutral effect of consuming butter on heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and all-cause mortality. However, as I mentioned earlier, there are other studies that have shown that saturated fats like butter does increase LDL cholesterol. This may mean that while there may be no clear indications that butter is the main or sole contributor to these heart diseases, it can impact markers of heart disease like cholesterol. Now, while the study found little to no effect from eating butter, it also mentioned that including more unsaturated fats have positive health benefits. So does that mean you should go to town and eat more butter? Probably not. I mean, too much of anything isn't necessarily good for you, and eating more saturated fat, which has either a negative or potentially a neutral effect, depending on which study you read, should not really be the goal. Rather, what it says to me is, according to the research, it may mean that enjoying a little butter on your mashed potatoes may not have the overwhelming negative effect on heart health that we once believed. So I know who to believe on all this, right? Nutrition research is notoriously rife with confounders and inconsistencies. And of course, the evidence on saturated fat is no different. But to me, it comes down to a really important question. What has a greater impact on heart disease? High intakes of saturated fats or low intakes of polyunsaturated fats and complex carbohydrate? By looking at the body of evidence, considerations around saturated fat and the risk of heart disease are really twofold. One, saturated fat in isolation may appear to play a role in heart disease by increasing heart disease risk factors. But depending on which research you read, it seems like it may or may not increase the risk of death from heart disease itself. Shifting the focus to consuming more unsaturated fats seems to have a more clear beneficial effect in the literature. With that said, we should be less concerned with the total saturated fat intake and more concerned with emphasizing greater intakes of unsaturated fats, specifically polyunsaturated fats like omega-3s. And two, replacing saturated fats with high fiber carbohydrates but not refined carbohydrates should be the other goal, as fiber, specifically soluble fiber, has demonstrated a clear benefit towards reducing cholesterol levels and improving overall heart health. Now, while the evidence is mixed as to whether or not saturated fat actually causes harm and to what extent, what we do know is that saturated fat also doesn't seem to provide much benefit to our heart either. So if we focus instead on adding more of the clearly beneficial heart-healthy foods like unsaturated fats and higher fiber carbs, which have shown a clear benefit, it will naturally kind of edge out any potential negative health effects of saturated fat. Now, with that said, what's the deal with coconut oil? Well, marketing of coconut oil has exploded in recent years, which can, of course, give people the impression that this is really, really good for you. But we also know that coconut oil is high in saturated fat. In fact, to compare, 1 tablespoon of other sources of saturated fat like butter or ghee or cream all contain less than 10 grams of saturated fat per tablespoon, whereas 1 tablespoon of coconut oil contains around 12 to 13 grams of saturated fat. So will coconut oil put you at risk for heart disease, or is it actually beneficial? Well, we don't know for sure. Research on coconut oil is admittedly mixed. However, most quality research suggests that coconut oil can in fact raise bad LDL cholesterol while also raising good HDL cholesterol. Interestingly, despite being really high in saturated fats, some research suggests that it may not raise LDL cholesterol as much as other saturated fats. So it is possible that the net effect isn't bad. For instance, one 2017 randomized control trial compared the effects of butter, coconut oil, and olive oil on the cholesterol levels of 96 men and women with no previous history of chronic disease. Despite being wildly different in saturated fat content, there were no differences in the LDL levels of those fed coconut oil versus olive oil. In contrast, butter did significantly increase LDL cholesterol compared to coconut oil, which was surprising considering that coconut oil is actually higher in saturated fat than butter. Again, I want to just flag that these are actually heart disease risk factors or markers, not actual heart disease risk. But anyways, the varying effects of these two saturated fats on cholesterol levels likely has to do with the differences in their fatty acid profiles, as coconut oil is made up of around 40% lauric acid, whereas butter is made up mainly of palmitic and stearic acids. Lauric acid is a unique medium-chain fatty acid that's digested and metabolized differently from other kinds of fatty acids. Studies have shown that while lauric acid does have cholesterol-raising effects, it is proportionally higher for HDL cholesterol than LDL cholesterol. Another study in women with abdominal obesity also found that coconut oil increased HDL cholesterol and even helped to reduce waist circumference. With all of this in consideration, despite coconut oil being high in saturated fat, it may be a better choice compared to other saturated fats like butter, as it may have a more favorable effect on cholesterol levels. That said, most registered dietitians and other nutrition professionals agree that coconut oil should be treated just like any other food and enjoyed in moderation, while also being used in rotation with largely unsaturated fats. However, if you're particularly susceptible to high cholesterol, an unsaturated fat like olive oil may still be a better choice. What about recommendations to eat low fat or no fat, or specifically to avoid high fat dairy? The long-standing negative perception of dietary fat has really resulted in the preference for a lot of low-fat diets and low-fat or fat-free products on the market. However, low-fat and fat-free options are not necessarily healthier, as food manufacturers often have to add more sodium or more sugar to compensate for the lack of mouthfeel. Just use light peanut butter as an example. If you look at light versus regular natural peanut butter, you'll see that the light version has just 10 fewer calories, but it has less protein, less healthy fat, more sodium, and twice the carbohydrates. So what you're really doing is just reducing the satiety profile of peanut butter when you assume that lower fat is actually better. Not to mention, it just doesn't taste as good either. As for dairy, we know that the official guidelines will still tell you to choose low or fat-free dairy, but a lot of the updated research doesn't seem to support this idea. For one, research actually suggests that consuming more high-fat dairy is associated with lower body fat percentage, lower body weight, weight circumference, and triglyceride levels. In the Women's Health Study, for example, with almost 20,000 women, they found that higher amounts of high-fat dairy, but not low-fat dairy, was associated with a lower risk of obesity. Research has also looked at its impact on cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And in a comprehensive review of the literature, it was suggested that not only does full-fat dairy not seem to be associated with heart disease and type 2 diabetes, but that some full-fat dairy like fermented yogurt and cheese may actually have a protective effect. Now, like most research that looks at an outcome like weight gain that doesn't happen overnight, these are cohort studies and not randomized control trials. But there are a few reasons why this association may hold true. First is that, like with coconut oil and its lauric acid, there are other components and unique fatty acids in dairy that have really unique health properties. So things like conjugated linoleic acid, butyric acid, and palmitoleic acid. Higher fat dairy tends to also be more satiating and satisfying, so you may just not feel the need to eat as much. Or maybe it's what I'll call the Weight Watchers effect, and that is that people who eat more higher fat dairy maybe just tend to diet less often and have better relationships with food, which we also know plays a really important role in weight gain and overall health over time. Bottom line, I'm not a dairy pusher. If you don't like it, don't eat it. But if you do, then all I'm saying is that you don't necessarily need to be buying processed fat-free cheese anymore, specifically in the name of health. Now, with all of that said, and I know it's confusing, what are some actual evidence-based ways to reduce your risk of heart disease through diet? Number one, choose whole grains over refined grains. One meta-analysis found that eating just 3 or more servings of whole grains daily was associated with 22% reduced risk of heart disease. So you want to be sure to look for the term whole grain on the ingredient list, as this means that the entire grain is intact. Number 2, eat more berries. Berries are chock full of heart-healthy polyphenols, vitamin C, and fiber. So it's no surprise that numerous studies have demonstrated the power of berries for heart health. Not only are they a powerful antioxidant, but they also have been found to significantly lower LDL cholesterol and blood pressure. Number 3, add in some dark leafy greens. Dark leafy greens like spinach, kale, collard greens, and mustard greens are not only high in fiber, but they're also rich in vitamin K, which helps to protect our arteries. One meta-analysis even found that increasing one's intake of dark leafy greens was associated with a 16% lower risk of heart disease. Number 4, increase your omega-3s. Omega-3 fats are important for helping to reduce inflammation and in turn protect our heart. Research suggests that regularly eating salmon, which is one of nature's most potent sources of omega-3s, for just 8 weeks actually significantly reduced blood pressure. When choosing fish, I recommend looking for ones that are higher in omega-3s like salmon, trout, mackerel, or sardines, and serving them baked, broiled, or grilled without a batter or deep frying. Delicious plant-based sources can include things like chia seeds, walnuts, flax seeds, and hemp hearts. Number 5, eat more high-fiber beans and legumes. Beans and other pulses are not only great plant-based proteins, but they're rich in resistant starch and fiber, which research suggests may help to reduce bad LDL cholesterol. So throw a handful of chickpeas into your salad, your white beans in your soup, black beans in your tacos, and lentils in your curry for some heart-healthy and, of course, money-conscious meals. Number 6, eat more plant-based fats like nuts, seeds, and avocado. As a fantastic source of monounsaturated fats and fiber, nuts, seeds, and avocado can be your heart-healthy BFFs. Some nuts and seeds like walnuts, flax, or hemp hearts even have those plant-based omega-3s we were just talking about. So research has found that eating nuts reduced the risk of heart disease, while another study found that those who ate avocados regularly were half as likely to develop metabolic syndrome. Number 7, eat the rainbow. When it comes to eating vegetables and fruit, color is king. There are a number of important antioxidants that can be derived from brightly colored veggies. So lycopene in tomatoes, for example, which I know is a fruit, has been linked to a reduced risk of heart disease and stroke, while alpha and beta carotene in orange carrots or yellow beets have been shown to lower the risk of death from heart disease. There are so many delicious ways to get your colorful veggie fix, from peppers to squash to pumpkins and beets, so choose a favorite and get cooking. Number 8 is to swap some of your meat for soy protein to make some more meatless meals. Soy protein found in tofu, tempeh, edamame, and soy milk is packed with soy isoflavones, which research suggests may help to reduce total cholesterol and bad LDL cholesterol. Try switching your cream for soy in your coffee, throwing some tofu into your stir fry, or adding edamame to your salads or soups. Number 9, choose more monounsaturated oils like olive oil more often. As I discussed in my oil video here, we do know that extra virgin olive oil contains those really healthy monounsaturated fats that we want to include in abundance. One study found that those who consumed the most olive oil, for example, were 35% less likely to develop heart disease. That's impressive. Number 10, drink more green tea. Not only is matcha super trendy right now, but it's rich in polyphenols and catechin antioxidants, which research suggests may help to lower LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. So if you're not into replacing your morning joe with tea, you can also mix matcha powder into oatmeals, smoothies, or desserts. Bottom line, does saturated fat cause heart disease? Well, while we still don't know for certain to what extent saturated fat is harmful to our health, I strongly believe that we need to stop vilifying any one particular food or food component, and this includes saturated fat. While the research remains controversial, and I ultimately do believe we should err on the side of caution, I also think that the focus should be less on completely cutting saturated fat out and more on what we can add to our diet to add value. Saturated fat may or may not be bad, but the general consensus from the body of contradictory evidence suggests that it's probably not that beneficial either. The research is clear that unsaturated fats and fiber-rich carbohydrates may be more beneficial. So let's try to focus on adding more of those foods in. That means there's still room for ice cream and butter and coconut milk, but the priority should be on nuts, seeds, avocado, and olive oil whenever possible. I believe that when we eat a diet full of variety, we're providing our body with the important nutrients that it needs while also satisfying our desire for delicious and diverse food. So aim for balance, but also remember that life is too short to completely eliminate foods that you actually love. And on that note, if you like this video, please be sure to give it the thumbs up. Leave me a comment below with any big nutrition questions that you'd like me to tackle. Subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time on Abby's Kitchen. Bye!